is Tony Marlow, and I'm the CMO at IAS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this next session in your customized agenda. Today we're going to be tackling a fantastic topic, and we have an even more impressive lineup of panelists. The topic we're going to be going through over the next 20 to 30 minutes or so is addressing transparency in the programmatic supply chain. Obviously, a hot topic for the industry right now. And joining me to talk through some of the questions, big and small, related to this. Firstly, we have Phil Smith. He's the Director General at ISBA. Thank you for joining us, Phil.
Hello.
And for those of you who aren't familiar, ISBA is the industry body that represents the leading UK advertisers. Phil heads up this organization. So that means he drives ISBA's strategic direction, its advocacy agenda, and he also looks after the day-to-day operations. Fun fact about Phil, he's a keen runner and an open water swimmer year round. So he's a brave man, all while parenting 5 children. I don't know how you find the time, Phil, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Also joining us is Richard Reeves, the Managing Director of the AOP, the Association of Online Publishers. So Richard provides a voice for online publishing through his role as MD at the AOP, and he works with cross-industry bodies. He champions the future of online publishing. Fun fact about Richard, he was actually recognised by The Drum as one of the UK's 100 most influential people in digital advertising. So no small feat there. Thank you for joining us, Richard.
Thank you.
Okay, and last but by no means least, we have Will Luttrell. He's the CEO at Amino Payments. Hi, Will.
Hi, Tony. Good to see you.
Good to see you. So some might call Will a pioneer in the verification space. Full disclosure, he's actually a co-founder at IAS, obviously the company for which I work right now, previously our CTO, but now Will is the chief executive at Amino Payments, a company that's committed to delivering transparency and supply path optimization for digital advertising. Fun fact about Will, I have it on good authority that he's a dangerously good poker player and an avid musician to boot. So watch your chips if you find yourself in the same game as Will. Okay, thanks for joining us. Right, now before we dive in, I think it's worth overtly acknowledging 2020, so far it's been a year of, shall we say, challenge, a year of change in many, many ways, macro and micro. But there are a few things that I've noticed from our industry, so marketing professionals, publishing professionals, things that we hear from clients. They're telling us that right now, efficiency is top of mind more than ever before. So efficiency in advertising expenditure vis-a-vis the outcomes that they receive, also efficiency in terms of the associated efforts and human capital that we rally to do the things that we're setting out to achieve. And I think in 2020, the industry has been adjusting to a new way of operating. And as a part of that landscape, ISBA and PwC recently published a report focusing on programmatic supply chain transparency, and it highlighted some issues related to transparency. I'm going to very briefly summarize a couple of the key findings. Obviously, many are aware of this report and it's widely available. But we found in that, well, that report found, I should say, content publishers are receiving around half of ad expenditure. And I think one of the hot ticket headlines out of that was the report and PwC were unable to attribute 15% of programmatic ad spend at all. They don't know where that 15% was going. So amid the findings of this report and others like it, the advertising industry is deeply investigating the notion of transparency. And that's why we've brought these experts here together for a discussion. So with that, that's enough from me. Given the topic at hand, I think what I'd love to ask this panel is essentially, maybe we level set around, what does transparency mean to you? This is a question for everyone, but Phil, given what we just said about ISBA, you might be a good place to start. Transparency, what does it mean to you?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think transparency, somebody said, is needed when you don't have trust. And I think one of the issues that's most in play here is about alignment of interests through the supply chain when there are so many participants. And I think from that point of view, you know, for the study that we did, advertisers and publishers were both keen to understand end to end how that supply chain added up to get to a better understanding of how well it was working and how it could be improved.
Okay, so thank you, Phil. We're having some technical difficulties on Richard's video, but we do still have his audio. So Richard, Maybe you can tell us, what does transparency in this context mean to you?
Well, in this context, it's simply about the right to audit and inspect your own supply chain. I think before the video went funny, I think the issue you also talked about was general feelings and response to the unknown delta that was identified. And I think the point I was very keen to make is that the important thing here, despite the way in which certain people chose to interpret this report, is that there is no suggestion that there are nefarious practices being undertaken. It's more a question of recognizing that such is the exponential growth of programmatic and its now significance as a means to be able to trade and place advertising at scale in real time. We have to recognize that it's grown at such a rate that we're now in a position that we need to revisit exactly what it is that we need to be able to do to improve the efficiencies around how we all benefit from the use of the programmatic landscape.
Absolutely. And Will, what about your perspective? Do those points of view mesh with yours? What does transparency mean to you?
So building on Phil and Richard's excellent answers, I'll dig in a little bit more granular, I guess. I find when I think about transparency, there are three primary aspects. So the first is identity. Do you know the identities of all the of everyone that's involved in the transaction at every single impression as a buyer and a seller? Do you know the DSP that was involved, the exchange that was involved, who was the seller on the exchange, and ultimately who was the media owner? So that's number one, and can you verify that? Number two is qualitative information. Was the ad viewed, potentially using a verification company like Integral Ad Science? Was it brand safe? Was it SIVT or human? So that's a very important second piece of transparency. And then third is potentially the most contentious amongst the ad tech and agency world, and that is, can you identify all the fees that were taken out at every hop of the way in that supply chain from the buyer to the media owner? So those three components, the identity, the qualitative metrics, and then finally the fees from every single impression, is our very fine definition of what transparency means.
That's really interesting. I'd be interested in anyone else's perspective about this, particularly that third point. What about disclosing fees or technology to give visibility into fees? How important is that component of the three?
Well, let me jump in with a perspective, because I know this gets some level of debate, and particularly in respect of the study that we ran. We had 15 premium brands and 12 quality publishers looking to share and exchange their data to understand their own supply chains. And the thing we found was that it was very, very difficult to be able to do that. And as Richard said, it took 9 months for us to get the data. We were able to match 12% of the impressions of the nearly 270 million impressions that we were looking at. And the supply chains that currently exist isn't easy to, it's next to impossible to audit. So I think for us, the question here is, when the buyer and the seller both want to exchange their data, and it's so difficult for it to do, then that's a situation that needs to change.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to what Phil said there, to basically reiterate exactly the point that what we're all endeavoring to achieve off the back of this study and working across with all of our partners in the industry is to drive a more transparent supply chain that facilitates better data sharing and campaign monitoring. Now, that will be achieved by all agreeing to set standards for data access, consistent data taxonomies, definitions and data retention policies, just as examples, and potentially improve use of campaign IDs throughout supply chains. So really, this is about a natural development and maturing, if you like, of this process. And one of the challenges that Phil's touched on was the complexity that PwC found by virtue of the fact that whilst as individual businesses, the partners that you work with in your supply chain may indeed provide very clear opportunities for transparency. The reality is everybody has multiple partners, and not one same partner provides, if you like, exactly the same approach to data access or taxonomies. And so the difficulty at the moment is that without alignment of that, the ability to then move to that stage of greater transparency and ease to access and right to audit is compromised.
So could I ask the group then on that last point, does that mean there's a need for consistency when it comes to some sort of an audit trail or an audit report?
Certainly, we think one of the things that needs to be done is some standardization when it comes to the way in which data is formatted and retained in a way that would permit another audit of this kind in the future. It's possible that might involve some form of transaction ID, but at the moment there are no protocols. And to Richard's point, a lot of the actors are saying that they're transparent, and we have no reason to dispute that. But I think individual transparency is being masked at the moment by a systemic lack of transparency through the chain.
And Tony, to address that question as well, I think an underlying principle is that it has to become easy or automatic. The great work that occurred with the ISBA PwC study, is also backed by a lot of hard work and a lot of money and time, frankly, that brands and agencies, in a world of ever tightening budgets and an increased need for efficiency, very few brands can launch into a 6-month study to figure out what happened, where at the end of it, you discover what happened 6 months ago. And so, whatever technology develops and whatever the industry takes forward as next steps, it has to be, easy and probably even always on. And I'm saying this, not trying to be too self-serving, trying to talk from more of an industry standpoint, but the idea behind standardization and technology is to make it so that brands can turn it on, perhaps, and see transparency, what's happening in real time, so they can get on with it and not have to undertake expensive, time-intensive efforts to get this kind of insight.
I think Will makes a valid point. I think that's got to be an aspiration of sorts, but I think in the first instance, it's this point again, and I'm sorry to be like to sort of be repetitive about it, but until we have all come together, which I believe is really the opportunity and the gift of the task force that's been created off the back of this, until we come together and can agree on naming conventions and what those standards and those formats look like in a way that every party within the waterfall is comfortable with, then we can't move forward, and we can't look at other infrastructures and solutions that may absolutely provide the opportunity that Will outlines with an always-on type solution. But first and foremost, we need to address those naming conventions, those standards, and ensure that basically what means for me means the same for you. It's as simple as that.
So Richard, I might pick that up because there was the component about the technological standardization and timeliness. But when we talk about those next steps, both you and Will just mentioned it, whose responsibility is it to ensure transparency? I mean, is there a specific burden of responsibility, and does it rest with a particular part of the ecosystem? Is it advertisers? Is it publishers? Industry bodies? Is it someone else in the supply chain? And Richard, I might start with you, given what you just said. Where does this responsibility for transparency lie?
Well, if we treasure the ability to continue to sustain ourselves as a self-regulated industry, then it's a collective responsibility. Because I think one of the most exciting opportunities that this coming together that has begun through the task force off the back of the report is presenting is that recent announcements, for example, by the CMA about the inception of the DMU, what we have the opportunity to be, if we can all work collectively, is to be a think tank for those government regulators and bodies such as the CMA and the DMU, so that we can provide an understanding to them, and we can provide evidence around what works and what doesn't work. And with that ability to work collectively, then we continue to maintain our privilege of being a self-regulated industry. So it's a collective responsibility. And just to refer to a point you touched on earlier, in terms of transparency, this isn't about everybody publishing out their fees and their secret sources. But what it is about is that where you have partners who are ostensibly an essential part of your own waterfall, then it is important that within those contracts and those arrangements that you have with those partners, that there is a recognized consistency about what we mean by transparency and standards, and that all partners within those agreements and contracts are able to provide exactly the same explanation and transparency around that, as regardless of who that partner may be within your supply chain. It's the consistency. But so the answer to your question is it's a collective responsibility of all of us in the industry if we continue to treasure the ability to self-regulate.
So Tony, responsibility is an interesting world and an interesting word in our ecosystem. I tend to think of it more along the lines of what needs to happen to get everyone to take responsibility for transparency, and that is, I think it ultimately lands in the hands of the buyers who have the control. And in every single study that we've done, and I'm sure Phil, you saw the same thing, there are supply paths that are more transparent and more forthcoming with data, and there are supply paths that are less transparent and less forthcoming with data needed to do this work. And when buyers, especially as parts of large bodies like ISBA, the ANA, the WFA, agency holding companies have a role to play here. When they move money towards more transparent supply paths, that will have the effect of making the entire supply chain more transparent. And so I think it's less a question of responsibility and more a question of buyers seizing control of their mandate to know what's happening with their money that they put into what will be $1 trillion ecosystem once the CTV and OTT revolution are completed in the coming decade. It's up to buyers to know what's happening with their money.
Yeah, and I'd certainly agree. There's a huge role here for buyer awareness and buyer pressure. But I would also agree with the point about collective responsibility. I mean, we're here at this stage because people have taken individual responsibility for their own business evolution, and nobody's looked after the system as a whole. As Richard has said, we've got regulators looking now at the market, the Competition and Markets Authority, and their proposal to set up a digital markets unit. They wrote a particular chapter on this aspect of the market, and were concerned especially about conflicts of interest. And we certainly believe that the industry as a whole would be well advised to come together and to preempt regulatory intervention by taking matters into its own hands. But as you say, I think the buyers are the ones who, at the end of the day, are the ones who can most be the catalyst for that action.
Yeah, I would agree with that point.
So interesting. We've got three perspectives in a really similar territory. I interpret what was just said as everyone has their own flavor of what Richard originally termed collective responsibility. Richard, I heard you say we're going to come together, we'll self-regulate. Will, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I essentially heard you say it's a collective responsibility, but we need to recognize that money talks, and the change agents will be those buyers. And then Phil, you're talking about the role of regulatory bodies amid collective responsibility. It's quite interesting that I think we all ladder up to the same perspective, just with some different angles. So if we move on from responsibility, I'm really interested in the panel's perspective on media quality. And Will, I might given your company and given your expertise, I might start with you. So what is the role of media quality vis-a-vis the supply path transparency into cost? Is it important to know both, or is the transparency only applied to the cost side of things?
Oh, well, absolutely. So with transparency comes many salutary benefits. And one of those is around media quality. So for example, knowing the supply path, the identities that spoke of it earlier, of all the intermediaries, your DSPs, exchanges, sellers on exchanges, et cetera, to get to media can be as important as the media itself. So case in point, you may be buying, Yahoo.com 50 different ways, and that's something that we commonly see in our work. But what you will see is a dramatic difference in the viewability rates and the cost per viewed impression. You'll see dramatic variability about whether or not you have full transparency all the way down to Yahoo itself or a reseller on an exchange. There will be many differences in how you're buying the media that will impact quality, that come into play by knowing, by having transparency, not just the fact that you're buying Yahoo.com.
And so that means sometimes it's potentially possible that sometimes your most expensive impressions could actually be your lowest quality impressions based off some of those criteria like viewability, suitability.
Absolutely. We find dramatic variance in media quality based on supply path to the exact same inventory. And, hopefully this is good news to Richard as more buyers start paying attention to this. You will also find paths that give you more working media making its way down to the publisher. You're actually ultimately participating in a system where you're trying to get the most efficient path to what it is you're buying, which is an impression served by a publisher in a great environment, in view, et cetera. So buyers will optimize for media quality, and they'll also optimize to make sure that the most money is making its way to the end product, which is working media on the publisher side.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it's an and, it's not an or. Both sides of the equation are really important here. And we talk about efficiency, but I think advertisers are just as concerned about effectiveness. And the advertisers who invested in this study did so because they know that this channel works for them. They just think it can work a lot better. And in order to make it work better, you need to be tweaking the dials on both sides of the chain, both in the transaction path, but also then in the quality dimensions on the other side.
I mean,
exactly.
I'm sorry, Richard.
No, all I was going to say, exactly. I mean, we use this lovely, colourful language as an analogy for what we do. And when we talk about waterfalls, visualize it as a waterfall. Quite frankly, you've got a reservoir at the top, and if what's trickling down to the bottom isn't what you're expecting to trickle down, without the ability to be able to inspect where those faults lie, then it's very challenging for everyone. And I think that publishers are the first to accept that there is a cost of sale, and I think advertisers equally recognize there is a cost to their process, and there are partners, intermediaries throughout that process that should be rightfully and appropriately rewarded for the role that they play in enabling the completion of the act, which is the placement of the ad in an environment. And I think that there's no issue around that, but the issue is that if we can't see when things do not necessarily come out at the other end as we expect, then the inability to inspect that just compromises the efficiency of the entire process.
To sum it up, if you're buying an impression through one path at 80% of the cost of an impression through another path, but it's only viewed a quarter of as frequently, then you're losing money. At the end of the day, the report will tell you that you just saved 20%, but you lost all that money back to buying inventory that is not going to perform for you.
Absolutely.
Interesting. So we see transparency, and transparency in terms of cost, transparency in terms of supply paths that are opaque, making them less opaque, including who are the participants along that chain. And we also see the media quality side of it. It's pretty interesting. So as we sort of stretch into our last question, we've covered a lot. And Phil, you said something a few moments ago. You were talking about tweaking the dials. I'd be really interested in each of your perspective on, what are some of the practical steps you either have seen this year or would recommend different parts of the advertising ecosystem? What do they need to implement to raise these levels of transparency, raise the level of trust and accountability through the chain? So I might just go through, Phil, if you don't mind, I might ask you to represent advertisers. What are those practical steps you either see or would recommend for these things?
Well, I think one of the first practical steps is take an interest and educate yourself. There are many advertisers who are not doing that at the moment, and we'd certainly be keen to raise levels of awareness and education there. Potentially put more dedicated resource against it. And then I think the other big question to ask is which parts of the process and the value chain do you want to start taking a direct involvement in yourself, whether it's in contracts or hands-on keys? But I certainly think these are questions that advertisers need to be actively ask themselves, because the more that they delve into this, the more they are likely to be able to make those optimization steps.
And from a publisher perspective, Richard, what would you say the practical steps you've seen or would recommend so far this year?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of recommendations we've made to publishers that are actions they can undertake immediately off of the back of this report. And just one point I want to make first that's related to where we were just now. I think an element of transparency will also aid all parties to have better approach to where they can compete, and by that I'm specifically talking about the awareness of within that supply chain what proportion of that working media, for example, that we touched on, is going into third-party data. And as publishers develop more robust first-party data, the PwC report demonstrated an opportunity there for publishers to be able to create a proposition that enables them to go after some of that other element of the initial investment that perhaps they might not have been aware of before in terms of where the investment goes. But in terms of the response from publishers, it's about ensuring that your SSP contracts and relationships are fit for purpose. Update those contracts and have very clearly defined terms. The whole thing, as I said, has grown so rapidly, exponentially, that if you can review these things with greater frequency, in the very least annually, you've also got to take into account the technical innovations that constantly occur. And that will no doubt impact on the fees, and you may not be aware that you are now paying for other services. So take into account and review technical innovations, undertake audits with more frequency. And ultimately, as a publisher, what we need is greater access to log level data, and start evaluating your supplier relationships in terms of other post-auction practices, post-auction finance arrangements, and other trading arrangements, where variable fees may apply, like foreign exchange and so forth. And also consider the amount of partners you have in terms of resellers and so forth. Those are things that can be undertaken now without a uniform decision on a new approach and a set of standards from the industry. Those are things you can do now as a publisher.
That's great. And Will, your perspective on the practical steps?
So what excellent answers from Phil and Richard. I would say that particularly from buyers again, you know, in addition to educating yourself and taking some of the practical steps that Richard mentioned, which is to really dig in and look at your contracts and examine the supply chain, then it's a matter of doing one of two things. So first thing I believe you need to do is work with your programmatic partners about their tools to act on all the wonderful things that you have now just learned after you've educated yourself and you've started collecting the data that you need to. So work with them on what tools they have available. Pressure them on their roadmap for making more tools available. If you are buying the same web property 50 different ways and the bottom 20 are just not as performant or as efficient or as quality as you would like, and you'd like to funnel more money to the best performing, best quality ways, or the ones with the least amounts of margin being taken in the middle, then what tools are available to you to do that? And then the second thing is move your money towards the supply chains that are more transparent and do offer more opportunities to act on findings as they make themselves available to you. Again, Tony, you summed it up. Money talks in our industry, and the ad tech middle layer agencies, publishers are all extremely responsive to buyer dollars moving, indicating market pressure to adopt certain things like transparency.
Well, thank you. And there we are at time now. I wish we could keep talking on this. What a great panel. But gentlemen, Phil, Richard, Will, in alphabetical order by first name, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. We really appreciate your contributions here. So thank you for that. And to all of our viewers, I hope you enjoyed the session and enjoy the rest of the summit. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.